For decades, a list existed, not a rumor, not a conspiracy theory whispered in the dark corners of the internet. A real list, a documented, verified, undeniable record of names, powerful names, famous names, names that appear on the walls of Senate chambers and the mastheads of billion-dollar corporations, names that have shaped laws, controlled narratives, and decided what the American public was and was not allowed to know. And for decades, the men on that list spent unimaginable amounts of money, influence, and political capital making sure you would never see it. They sealed the courtrooms. They pressured the prosecutors. They silenced the witnesses. Private jets moved quietly between islands and capitals while the rest of the world was told there was nothing to see. Evidence disappeared. Hard drives were wiped. And the few journalists brave enough to pull on the thread found themselves suddenly discredited, suddenly unemployable, suddenly alone. This was not incompetence. This was architecture. A carefully constructed wall between the powerful and the consequences that were supposed to find them. A system so deeply embedded in the institutions of American power that most people who tried to dismantle it didn't even know where to begin. But here is what the people behind that wall never accounted for. They never accounted for Kash Patel, a man who spent his entire career being told he was too aggressive, too persistent, too inconvenient. A man the establishment mocked in confirmation hearings, buried in smear campaigns, and tried to disqualify at every turn, precisely because they knew, on some level, what would happen if he ever got close enough to the files. He got close enough. And what he revealed in front of the cameras, in front of the Senate, in front of an entire nation that had been waiting for this moment longer than most people realize, it didn't just shake Washington. It cracked the wall. The people who spent decades building it, maintaining it, and hiding behind it never saw it coming. And tonight, you're going to see exactly how it happened and exactly why it changes everything. Stay with us, because this story is only beginning. That let's be very clear about something before we go any further. This is not a celebrity scandal. This is not a tabloid story about a dead financier and his famous friends. This is not the kind of thing you file away under weird news and forget about by morning. What we are talking about, what we have always been talking about, for those paying close enough attention, is the single most important question in American public life. Do the rules apply to everyone? Or do wealth, connection, and political power create a separate category of human being? One that exists above accountability, above consequence, above the law itself? Jeffrey Epstein did not operate alone. That much has never been seriously disputed. What has been disputed, fiercely, expensively, and in some cases violently, is exactly who helped him, who knew, and who used their influence to make sure the full truth never reached the light. He ran a network. That network had clients. Those clients had names. And those names, for years, were protected by sealed court documents, redacted flight logs, and a justice system that seemed strangely reluctant to follow the evidence wherever it actually led. His death in a federal facility in 2019 ruled a suicide under circumstances that forensic experts and independent investigators have publicly and repeatedly questioned, did not end the story. It was supposed to. That was the point. But it didn't, because the files still existed. And files, unlike people, are very difficult to permanently disappear, especially when the right person is determined to find them. Enter Elon Musk. Whatever your politics, whatever your opinion of the man, there is one thing he did when he acquired Twitter, now X, that fundamentally changed the information landscape in this country. He refused to let certain stories die. He amplified voices the legacy media had spent years marginalizing. He turned a platform that was quietly becoming a tool of narrative control into something far more unpredictable and far more dangerous to those with secrets to keep. When Musk posts, 100 million people see it. When Musk asks a question out loud, that question cannot be unasked. And then there is Donald Trump, who has spent the better part of 2 years promising something that his supporters have treated as a sacred covenant and his opponents have dismissed as theater. Transparency, declassification, a reckoning with the permanent political class that has, in his telling, corrupted American institutions from the inside out. Whether you believe him or not, the political machinery he set in motion, the appointments he made, the directives he signed, the people he placed in positions of investigative authority, has now produced a moment that cannot be walked back. Because what most people still do not fully understand is what Kash Patel actually found buried inside those files. Not the names that have already leaked into the public conversation. Not the details that have been cautiously reported in carefully worded articles. Something else. Something the Senate was never supposed to see. Something that, once spoken aloud in that chamber, could not be taken back. To understand why that moment is so explosive, why the reaction was so immediate, so visceral, and so desperate, you first need to understand the man they tried everything to stop from ever reaching this position. To understand what we are truly up against, you have to stop thinking of the villain in this story as a single person. There is no one face to put on this. No single name that, once exposed, makes the whole problem disappear. What we are dealing with is something far more durable, far more dangerous, and far more difficult to dismantle than any individual. We are dealing with a system, a machine, one that was built over decades, quietly and deliberately, by people who understood one fundamental truth about power, that the best way to keep it is to make sure the rules that govern everyone else simply do not apply to you. This machine has many parts. It has prosecutors who received quiet phone calls from powerful attorneys and suddenly found their cases losing momentum. It has judges who sealed documents that the public had every legal and moral right to see. It has editors at major media organizations who killed stories, fully reported, fully sourced, ready to publish stories, because the people named in those stories were also the people who attended the same fundraisers, sat on the same boards, and moved through the same social circles as the people making editorial decisions. It has senators who stood before cameras and delivered passionate speeches about protecting the most vulnerable members of society, while their own travel records placed them uncomfortably close to the very network they were publicly condemning. The contradictions were not subtle. They were simply never examined, because the machine also controls the lens through which most Americans receive their information. When Epstein was first arrested in 2019, the initial wave of public outrage was enormous. For a brief moment, it seemed like the wall might actually come down. Names began to surface. Flight logs began circulating. Court documents, partially unsealed, contained references that pointed toward figures of enormous political and financial influence. And then, methodically, the machine went to work. Stories were reframed. Attention was redirected. The names that appeared in documents were reported with careful, lawyerly language that drained them of their significance. And when Epstein died in his cell, in a maximum security federal facility, on suicide watch, with the cameras inexplicably malfunctioning at precisely the relevant moment, the machine exhaled and moved on. Witnesses who came forward found their credibility attacked with surgical precision. Their pasts were excavated. Their motives were questioned. The message sent to anyone else considering speaking was received clearly. This is what happens. This is the cost. Stay quiet and stay safe. And then came Kash Patel's confirmation hearings, and the machine showed its face with a clarity that should have been shocking, but by that point felt almost predictable. Senator after senator approached that hearing not as an investigation of a nominee's qualifications, but as a performance of intimidation. They questioned his loyalty. They questioned his judgment. They invoked his past work exposing intelligence community abuses as evidence of instability rather than integrity. They used the word loyalist as though devotion to accountability were somehow disqualifying. One senator, barely concealing the contempt in their voice, suggested that a man who had spent his career fighting institutional corruption was somehow unfit to lead an institution. The irony was either completely lost on them or, and this seems far more likely, entirely intentional. Because here is what the machine understood, even if it could not say so out loud. Kash Patel was not dangerous because he was loyal to Trump. He was dangerous because he was loyal to something the machine has always found far more threatening: the truth. He had already proven, during his time on the House Intelligence Committee, that he was willing to follow evidence into places where powerful people did not want evidence to go. He had already demonstrated that titles, connections, and social consequences did not slow him down. He had already shown them exactly who he was. And they had tried everything. The smear campaigns, the media narratives, the coordinated whisper networks that work so effectively in Washington to destroy reputations without leaving fingerprints. None of it stopped him. None of it even slowed him down. These were people who believed, truly believed, that the rules simply did not apply to them. that every challenge could be managed, every threat could be neutralized, every inconvenient person could be discredited or exhausted into silence. They had done it before. They had done it many times. The machine was very good at what it did, but the machine had never had to deal with someone who had spent his entire life studying exactly how it worked. While the establishment played its games, traded its favors, and congratulated itself on its own invincibility, one man had been quietly preparing for exactly this moment. And that man was almost ready. Every story has a moment where you realize the protagonist was never an accident, that the path they walked, every detour, every hardship, every door slammed in their face, was not misfortune. It was preparation. And when you trace the arc of Kash Patel's life from its beginning to the moment he sat down in that Senate chamber, what you see is not a political career. What you see is a man being built, piece by piece, for a single defining confrontation with the most protected secrets in American history. He was born to immigrants. His family came to this country carrying the particular combination of hope and pragmatism that immigrant families know better than anyone. The understanding that nothing is given, that every opportunity must be earned twice over, and that the institutions of this country are worth believing in precisely because they are worth fighting for. That faith in institutions, real institutions, functioning institutions, institutions that actually deliver on the promise of equal justice, was not abstract for Kash Patel. It was personal. It was inherited. It was the foundation everything else was built on. He put himself through law school. He did not emerge into a corner office at a white shoe firm with a roster of corporate clients and a clear path to comfort. He became a federal public defender. Let that sink in for a moment. Before he ever prosecuted anyone, before he ever investigated anyone, before he ever sat across from the powerful and demanded answers, he spent years standing beside the powerless. People who had nothing. People the system had already decided it was finished with. People who needed someone in their corner who genuinely believed that the law meant what it said, that it applied to everyone, that it protected everyone, that it was not simply a tool available exclusively to those who could afford to wield it. That experience did something to him that no amount of political training could replicate. It showed him, from the ground up, exactly how justice fails, exactly where the cracks are, exactly how the gap between what the system promises and what it delivers is wide enough to swallow entire lives. He never forgot it. From the public defender's office, he moved into counterterrorism prosecution, working cases that most Americans never hear about. The painstaking, unglamorous, genuinely dangerous work of pursuing networks that operate in shadow. He was good at it. Exceptionally good. Because the skills required, patience, precision, the ability to follow a thread through layers of deliberate obfuscation and arrive at the truth buried underneath, turned out to be exactly the skills he had been quietly developing his entire career. Then came the House Intelligence Committee. And then came the moment that changed everything. When Kash Patel began pulling on the threads of what we now call Russiagate, examining the origins of the investigation, scrutinizing the sourcing of the intelligence, asking the questions that his colleagues had either not thought to ask or had quietly decided were too dangerous to ask, he did not find what the official narrative said he would find. He found something else entirely. He found a story of institutional manipulation so serious, so deliberate, and so damaging to the credibility of American intelligence and law enforcement that it demanded to be told publicly. He told it, and the machine turned on him with everything it had. The media coverage was immediate and merciless. He was reframed overnight, not as an investigator who had uncovered genuine wrongdoing, but as a partisan operative running cover for a president. The work was dismissed before it was examined. The findings were buried beneath the noise of the attacks on the man who had produced them. Colleagues who had privately acknowledged the validity of his research suddenly developed convenient amnesia. Friends in the professional world became strangers. The label Trump loyalist was applied with the precision of a weapon, designed not to describe him, but to discredit him, to ensure that anything he said could be filtered through a lens of partisan suspicion before it reached the public. He kept going. That is the part the machine never fully understood about Kash Patel. The attacks that would have finished most people, the kind of sustained, coordinated reputational assault that Washington executes with practiced efficiency, did not finish him. They clarified him. Every smear confirmed that he was close to something real. Every attempt to silence him told him exactly where the most important doors were. He had spent years defending people the system had written off. He knew what it looked like when an institution decided someone was inconvenient. He was not afraid of it. When his nomination was announced, the reaction from certain corners of Washington was not measured political opposition. It was panic. Thinly veiled, poorly disguised, absolutely revealing panic. The fury that erupted from precisely the people who had the most to lose was, in its own way, the loudest endorsement he could have received. This was not a man chasing power. This was not a man who had spent his life calculating the most advantageous positions to occupy. This was a man who had been forged, deliberately, painfully, across decades of thankless work and relentless opposition, into the only person capable of doing what was about to happen next. And when he finally sat down before the Senate, steady, prepared, carrying with him the weight of decades of buried secrets and the quiet confidence of someone who has already read the files, he did something that nobody in that room expected. He smiled, because he already knew what was coming. And when he finally sat down before that Senate, with the weight of decades of secrets behind him, what unfolded was something Washington had never seen before. The chamber was full in a way that Washington chambers rarely are anymore. Not just the senators in their seats, not just the staff members lining the walls with their tablets and their whispered conversations, but full in the way that only happens when everyone in the building understands, on some instinctive level, that what is about to occur will not be forgotten quickly. The press gallery was packed. Cameras that normally captured the dull procedural theater of confirmation hearings were positioned with unusual precision. Outside, in the corridors, staffers clustered around phones streaming the feed live. Across the country, in living rooms and offices, and on subway platforms, people were watching. And on X, Elon Musk had already posted 3 words before the hearing even formally opened, watching this closely. Within minutes, 40 million people knew to tune in. The first senator to approach the microphone did so with the practiced confidence of someone who had performed this particular ritual many times before. The tone was familiar, politely contemptuous, professionally dismissive, designed to establish dominance in the opening moments and never relinquish it. Questions about loyalty, questions about judgment, carefully constructed inquiries that were not really inquiries at all, but verdicts dressed in the clothing of due process. The implication threaded through every word was clear. You do not belong here. We have already decided, and this hearing is merely the formality before we make that official. Kash Patel listened. He nodded politely. He answered each question with a precision and a calm that seemed, in the context of the room's barely contained tension, almost unsettling. He did not lean forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not take the bait that was being dangled in front of him with increasing obviousness. He simply answered, clearly and completely, and then folded his hands and waited for the next question. The second senator was less subtle. The accusations came faster, sharper, with an edge that crossed from professional skepticism into something that felt personal. His past work was characterized as partisan sabotage. His findings on the intelligence community were described as fabrications constructed to serve a political master. One senator, voice climbing with theatrical indignation, jabbed a finger toward the witness table and demanded to know whether Kash Patel believed he was above the oversight of Congress. He looked at the senator for a moment before answering. Just a moment, long enough for the room to feel it. No, Senator, he said quietly. I don't believe anyone is above oversight, including the people in this room. The gallery stirred. On X, Musk posted a single laughing emoji. It received 600,000 likes in 11 minutes. From Mar-a-Lago, a source close to the president indicated that Trump was watching the feed with what was described as visible satisfaction. A single post appeared on Truth Social. No words, just a thumbs up. The signal was received, but the senators were not finished. If anything, the composure of the man across from them seemed to agitate them further. There is something deeply destabilizing about a person who refuses to perform distress on cue. The machine runs on the expectation that pressure produces panic. That sustained attack eventually cracks even the most prepared target. Senator after senator cycled through variations of the same assault, his background questioned, his motives impugned, his qualifications examined with a scrutiny that had never, notably, been applied to their own. And then one of them made a mistake. In the escalating rhythm of the hearing, reaching for something sharper than what had already been tried, one senator referenced a specific document, a specific set of records, named a specific connection in a way that was clearly intended to suggest impropriety, but that instead revealed, to anyone paying close enough attention, exactly how much that senator knew about the contents of the files in question. The room did not immediately react, but something shifted. Kash Patel's eyes moved from his notes to the senator's face with a slowness that felt almost deliberate. The slight adjustment in his posture was barely visible, but it was there. And the people watching most closely, the journalists, the legal observers, the colleagues who knew him well enough to read him, saw it immediately. The room could feel it. Something was coming. And the senators who had pushed the hardest were about to regret it. Then Kash Patel leaned into the microphone. And what he said next stopped the entire hearing dead in its tracks. He thanked them. That was the first thing he did, in a voice so measured, so completely devoid of agitation, that it produced the opposite of the intended effect. Instead of reassuring the room, it unsettled it. He thanked the senators for their questions. He acknowledged the importance of congressional oversight. He expressed his genuine respect for the institution and the process. And as he spoke those opening words with the unhurried patience of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he needed to rehearse nothing, something passed through the chamber like a current. A collective, wordless recognition that the temperature of this hearing had just changed completely. The senators who had been leaning forward in their chairs settled back almost imperceptibly. The ones who had been sharpening their next questions lowered their notes by a fraction. Because there is a particular quality to the calm of someone who is not trying to survive a confrontation. Someone who is, instead, simply waiting for the correct moment to end one. And every person in that room who had spent any significant time around power recognized it instantly. This was not a man defending himself. This was a man about to go on offense. He opened a folder. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical flourish of someone who has been waiting for their moment in the spotlight. He opened it the way a surgeon opens an instrument tray, methodically, without ceremony, because what came next was work, not performance. He began with the documents. Declassified records, he explained, that had been requested, reviewed, and cross-referenced against publicly available flight logs, financial disclosures, and court exhibits from the original Epstein proceedings. He described the process with technical precision, the methodology, the verification, the chain of custody for each piece of evidence. And as he did, the journalists in the gallery began to type with an urgency that had not been present 60 seconds earlier. Because what he was describing was not allegation. It was not inference. It was documented, sourced, and sitting in a folder on the witness table of a United States Senate hearing. The first layer landed quietly. A pattern of financial transfers, cross-referenced with travel records, that placed specific individuals who had publicly and repeatedly denied any substantive connection to Epstein's network, at specific locations on specific dates. The dates mattered. The locations mattered more. And the financial transfers, he noted without raising his voice even slightly, had been flagged internally by compliance officers at two separate institutions whose reports had subsequently been buried in interdepartmental review processes that lasted, in one case, for 6 years. 6 years. A senator shifted in his chair. The movement was small and involuntary and completely impossible to misread. The second layer was the agencies. He named them without theater, simply listed the specific points at which investigative momentum had stalled, the internal communications that documented pressure applied from above to redirect resources, narrow the scope, or in several documented instances, close inquiries entirely before they reached the individuals at the network's upper levels. He referenced the prosecutors, not by name, not yet, but with enough specificity that anyone familiar with the cases would know exactly who he meant, who had received what he described, carefully, as external counsel regarding the parameters of appropriate investigation. Another senator reached for a glass of water. In the gallery, a correspondent for one of the largest independent news organizations in the country was already on her phone, not filing copy, but making a call, her voice low and her expression the particular combination of controlled excitement and professional gravity that only appears on a reporter's face when they understand they are watching something that will define a news cycle for weeks. On X, Elon Musk posted a single word. Wow. Within 22 minutes it had been liked by 2 million people. Within the hour, the post had been seen by 60 million. The hearing, which had begun as a procedural confirmation process that legacy media outlets had planned to cover with a single paragraph, was now the top trending topic across every major platform simultaneously. People who had never watched a Senate hearing in their lives were sharing the live stream link. The machine that had spent years controlling the flow of this information was watching, in real time, as that control evaporated. The third layer was the witnesses. He described, with a quietness that made the content hit harder than any raised voice could have, the pattern of intimidation that had kept the most important voices, in this case silent, for so long. The procedural mechanisms used to delay depositions. The coordinated character attacks deployed against individuals who had come forward. The specific, documented instances in which witness protection resources that had been formally requested were denied at the administrative level without explanation. He placed a number on it. Not an approximation, not an estimate, but a specific, verified count of individuals who had formally attempted to provide testimony and been systematically prevented from doing so. The chamber was silent in a way that felt less like quiet and more like held breath. And then he delivered the line, leaning forward, just slightly, with the measured deliberateness of someone who has chosen every word with the care of a closing argument. He looked directly at the senators across from him and said, "The question before this body has never been whether this information existed. The only question that history will remember this institution being asked, is whether you chose to look at it." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The gallery, the staff, the journalists, the legal observers, everyone in that room absorbed those two sentences in complete stillness. Because they were not an accusation. They were not a political attack. They were simply, devastatingly, the truth. Framed with such precision and delivered with such absence of malice that there was no mechanism available to dismiss them. He closed the folder. He folded his hands on the table, and in a voice that was almost gentle, he added that the documents currently under review represented the first tranche of materials his office had identified as relevant to a full public accounting. There were more. The process of declassification and verification was ongoing. The American people, he said, had waited long enough. The files, he confirmed, were only the beginning. Within minutes, the most powerful names in America were reaching for their phones. By morning, the entire country would be talking about one thing. And there was no putting this back in the bottle. The hearing was still technically in session when the internet caught fire. It did not build gradually the way these things sometimes do. A slow accumulation of shares and reposts that reaches critical mass hours after the fact. This was immediate. This was simultaneous. This was the particular kind of digital explosion that only occurs when millions of people watch the same moment in real time and reach the same conclusion at the same instant. The clip of Kash Patel's final statement, those two sentences delivered with that stillness into that silence, was being shared before he had even finished closing his folder. Within the first hour, 3 hashtags were trending at the top of X simultaneously. Hashtag Epstein files. Hashtag Kash Patel. Hashtag expose them all. They did not take turns. They did not cycle through the algorithm in an orderly rotation. They sat there together, side by side, as a collective expression of something that had been building in the American public consciousness for years and had just found its outlet. TikTok followed within minutes. The clip cut into dozens of formats, set against dozens of different soundtracks, reaching audiences who had never engaged with political content in their lives. YouTube saw its live stream numbers for the hearing surge to figures that the platform had not recorded for a congressional proceeding in years. Elon Musk pinned the clip to the top of X without commentary. Just the video. Just the moment. Within 6 hours it had been viewed 40 million times. By the end of the day, that number would double. The decision to let the footage speak entirely for itself was, in its own way, the most powerful editorial choice available. Because there was nothing that needed to be added, and nothing that could have been added that would have made it land harder. The cable news response was its own story. Anchors who had spent months carefully avoiding the substantive details of the Epstein files, who had covered the story, when they covered it at all, with the kind of elaborate vagueness that communicates volumes about what is not being said, were now visibly, uncomfortably cornered by the simple fact of the hearing's existence. You could see it in the body language, the slight stiffness in the delivery, the unusual precision with which words were chosen. Several networks led their coverage not with what Patel had actually said, but with the reactions of the senators who had challenged him. A framing so transparent in its intent that the audience noticed immediately and said so, loudly, in real time, in the comment sections and reply threads that had become a parallel broadcast running alongside the official one. The independent creators drowned them out completely. Commentators, journalists, and citizen reporters who had been covering the Epstein case for years, who had been dismissed, demonetized, and algorithmically suppressed for doing so, found themselves suddenly, overwhelmingly vindicated. Their videos, their threads, their documented timelines of the cover-up were being shared by people who were encountering them for the first time and experiencing the particular disorientation of realizing how much had been available all along. The audience for independent political media did not just grow that day. It transformed. People who had trusted the legacy press exclusively were asking, publicly and with genuine anger, why they were only hearing certain details for the first time from a creator with a laptop and a YouTube channel. Then the story escaped the political bubble entirely. A prominent athlete with 30 million Instagram followers posted the clip with a single caption, "Why is nobody talking about this?" Within 4 hours, it had been viewed by an audience that had no overlap whatsoever with the traditional political news consumer. Celebrities followed. Musicians, figures from entertainment and sport who rarely touched anything resembling political commentary, found themselves unable to look away and unwilling to stay silent. The story had become too large, too documented, and too viscerally real to be contained within the usual boundaries of partisan media consumption. International outlets picked it up by evening. A major European broadcaster described the hearing as the moment America's most protected secret began unraveling on live television. A newspaper in Australia ran the clip on its front digital page with a headline that captured, in 8 words, what millions of Americans were feeling but struggling to articulate. The human ripple moved more quietly but cut deeper. Survivors' advocacy organizations released statements, measured, careful, but unmistakably emotional, expressing cautious hope that the hearing represented a genuine turning point rather than another procedural performance. Legal experts began appearing across platforms calling for new federal investigations, pointing to the specific documentary evidence Patel had referenced as sufficient grounds for reopening inquiries that had been closed prematurely. Prosecutors in 3 separate states confirmed publicly that their offices were reviewing case materials in light of the newly available information. And the senators who had attacked Patel most aggressively that morning, the ones who had jabbed fingers and raised voices and performed their contempt most theatrically for the cameras, went silent. Their offices released statements by late afternoon, terse, carefully lawyered, drained of any of the combative energy that had characterized the morning's performance. The statements said very little. That, too, said everything. Across the country, in apartments and houses and break rooms and bars, ordinary Americans sat with their phones and their laptops and their televisions and watched the story unfold with the particular electric feeling of people who understand they are living through a moment that will be referenced for a very long time. Not the feeling of a political victory. Something larger than that. The feeling of a truth that had been held underwater for decades finally, irresistibly, breaking the surface. But beyond the trending hashtags and the viral clips, one question still hung in the air. What does this actually mean for America? And what happens next? Let's take a step back from the hearing room. From the hashtags and the headlines and the senators reaching for their phones. From the viral clips and the cable news anchors and the 40 million views. Let's step back from all of it and ask the question that actually matters. What just happened? Not procedurally. Not politically, not in terms of which party gained leverage or which narrative won the news cycle. What happened in that chamber today, at the level that will still be significant 20 years from now, when the specific details have faded and what remains is only the shape of the story. Here's what happened. The truth survived. That sounds simple. It sounds like the kind of thing you stitch onto a pillow or print on an inspirational poster. But if you have been paying attention, not just today, not just this week, but across the years of obstruction and suppression and carefully engineered silence that preceded this moment, you understand that it is not simple at all. The truth surviving was not inevitable. It was not guaranteed. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people at enormous personal cost, sustained over years, against a system that was specifically designed to ensure that survival would never happen. This was never really about Jeffrey Epstein. It was never really about Kash Patel or Donald Trump or Elon Musk or any single figure whose name trended today. Those are the characters. The story is something older and larger and more fundamental than any of them. The story is about whether the most powerful institutions in the freest country on earth actually mean what they say. Whether the promise of equal justice under law is a living commitment or a decorative inscription. Whether the people this system was built to protect, all the people, not just the ones with resources and connections and the right last name, can trust that when they are wronged, the machinery of accountability will eventually actually move. Accountability is not a partisan value. It does not belong to the left or the right, to any administration or any movement. The protection of children is not a political position. The rule of law is not an ideological preference. These are the bedrock. These are the things that, when they erode, everything else erodes with them. And today, in a room full of cameras and conflict and barely concealed panic from the people with the most to lose, those things were, however imperfectly and incompletely, defended. But before we celebrate the institutions, we have to come back to the people the institutions failed. The survivors of Epstein's network did not wake up this morning thinking about trending hashtags. They did not experience today as a political victory or a media event. They experienced it as something far more complicated and far more painful. The strange, exhausting, bittersweet sensation of watching the world finally begin to catch up to what they have known and carried and tried to speak aloud for years, often at tremendous personal cost, often to audiences that were not ready to hear them. They deserve to be at the center of this story. They always did. Every moment of institutional courage today, every document released, and every truth spoken belongs first and most completely to them. One man, armed with documents and an unshakable belief that the truth deserves to be spoken, walked into the most powerful room in America and refused to be silent. That matters. It will always matter. But it matters most because of who it matters to. The people who were told for years that no one was coming, that the system had made its decision. That power had settled the question and they should accept the answer and move on. The answer was not settled. The question is still open. And you, every single person watching this right now, are part of why. Not metaphorically, literally. The pressure that forces institutions to act, that makes suppression untenable and silence unsustainable, does not come from heroes in hearing rooms alone. It comes from people who refuse to look away, who share the story when the algorithm tries to bury it, who ask the question out loud when the comfortable thing would be to let it go, who hold in their minds, even when it is inconvenient, the image of the people this system was always supposed to serve. That is what America is supposed to be. Not perfect, not without its failures and its corruptions and its long, painful distances between the promise and the reality, but always, stubbornly, still moving, still capable of the moment where the truth breaks the surface, still producing, somewhere in the machinery, the person who read every document and paid every cost and walked into the room anyway. The system did not save itself today. People saved it. Ordinary, determined, refused to be silenced people, in hearing rooms and newsrooms and living rooms across this country. And so as the dust settles, at least for now, we're left with one final thought. They spent decades making sure you would never see that list. They sealed the courtrooms. They buried the files. They discredited the witnesses and silenced the survivors and spent billions of dollars constructing a wall between their names and the consequences that were always supposed to find them. They were patient. They were powerful. And for a very long time, it worked. Tonight, you watched it begin to unravel. Not because the system suddenly developed a conscience. Not because the powerful voluntarily chose transparency. But because enough people, one determined man in a hearing room, millions of watching, refusing to look away people behind their screens, made silence impossible. That is how this always works. That is the only way it has ever worked. When truth has a voice, and people refuse to let that voice be buried, even the most protected networks eventually crack. You were part of that today. Don't underestimate what that means. If this story matters to you, and it should, hit subscribe. Share this video. Because the algorithm is not neutral. It buries what the powerful do not want trending. It quietly deprioritizes what makes the wrong people uncomfortable. The only thing that overrides it is you. Your share, your comment, your decision to send this to one person who needs to see it. You are the distribution. You always have been. And one more thing. What we uncovered while researching this video, the names that were not mentioned today, the connections that have not yet been spoken aloud in any hearing room. That story is coming. The next piece is larger than this one. The thread goes further than most people realize. You are going to want to be here for it. Stay with us. We are just getting started.